This is Religious Studies 3300. We're far into the semester now, more than halfway through the semester. And it is late March 2022. We're coming up on the 55th anniversary of Dr. King's delivery of the Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church in New York City. And I'm going to begin tonight's talk. I'm Andrew Smith, your teacher. I'm going to begin tonight's talk with talking about the religious basis for Dr. King's witness against the war in Vietnam and his witness against all war, his witness against World War III, the potential for nuclear war that he grew up with, that you and I are living with today. And I'm saying this talk to you guys exactly 1 month into the Russian escalation of the civil war in Ukraine. There's been a civil war in Ukraine between Russian separatists and Ukrainian forces already for about 8 years, but that war has gone into a full-blown invasion by Russian troops on the land and bombs from the sky attacking the people of Ukraine for the last month. And it's a humanitarian and moral tragedy. And of course, there are Christians and people of other faith traditions on both sides of the borders there. And any country that we go to war with, if we perceive of ourselves as a Christian nation, now, of course, that's a problematic concept to begin with in a secular society, but we have a lot of Christians in the United States. We will be killing Christians, in the countries with whom we go to war. And it is with that obedience to the teachings of Jesus and also to the actions of Jesus when he was confronted with violence in his own life as a politically problematic Messiah, subversive, a Nazarene in an occupied land with an empire and also a religious establishment that had to pay tribute to the political powers that be. He was tried and executed for claiming to be the king, for claiming to be God. He was guilty of his messianic aspirations, and he died for that. In the Garden of Gethsemane and the moments before, in the days before his execution, the disciples thought it might be appropriate to take up arms against the soldiers, and Christ asked them to put away their sword, and said that he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. So in the speech that we're going to listen to later, the very famous Beyond Vietnam speech, Dr. King said, "Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them?" And this is ability to see God's image, the face of Christ, or the face of your understanding of your higher power in the human being that is treating you wrong, in the person that's attacking you, and the person that is mistreating you, and to be able to see that there's some remnant of the divine within them, even as they are hurting you. This is the challenge of enemy love that Jesus taught, that Dr. King is witnessing to, and it's a very particular and a peculiar kind of calling. And in the world that we live in, not everybody feels convicted by this love, and there are certainly people who are of a religious mindset that don't think that this applies to the geopolitical realities of nation states and armies and wars and police forces and things of this nature. They believe that because of human sin, we must live in the real world, in the practical, pragmatic world where armies and guns are needed to keep order, is the countervailing and maybe more popular opinion. Jesus, of course, said in the wonderful poetry of the Sermon on the Mount that blessed are the peacemakers. He's called the Prince of Peace. Today, I wonder who we bless, who we would name in the litany of our blesseds are. Would we say, blessed are the women who have risen up in our world, leaders, women of color taking high positions in our country? First female vice president is a woman of color, elected just a little over a year ago. We're looking at perhaps the first female woman of color justice on the Supreme Court. Had other female justices, but not a woman of color. Other people of color, but not a woman of color, sitting on that bench. We maybe will be blessing those who are incarcerated or those who are unhoused, living on the streets, people who are recovering from drug addiction. Maybe we will be blessing our, hall residents in our dormitory who get on our nerves. Maybe we'll be blessing our fellow classmates, our teachers, as that we come to the end of another school year, blessing the state legislature as it passes yet another piece of problematic legislation, as the Divisive Concepts Law has now gone through and passed the Senate and the House of the Tennessee legislature. Maybe we'll be blessing our mothers and our children, our spouses and our siblings. Who would you bless today? How can we imagine a world in which the Sermon on the Mount would be practiced? Would we bless the bullied, the broken, the beat up, and the beautiful? There's many biblical proclamations for peace that have formed the Jewish and Christian peace tradition that King is rooted in. I've just chosen a couple more selections after the most famous one from the Sermon on the Mount. This in the Hebrew scriptures and the prophet Isaiah: he shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war anymore. For all the boots of the tramping warriors and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire. It's a popular folk song of a recent generation. Put my guns in the ground, I cannot use them anymore. It's so dark I cannot see, I'm knocking on heaven's door. Gospel songs, I'm gonna lay down my burden down by the riverside and study war no more. Going back to that famous Sermon on the Mount, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for the tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs, and do not refuse anyone who wishes to borrow. You have heard that it was said that you would love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And then that passage nearing the time of Christ's execution, Jesus said, put your sword back in its place. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he would at once send more than 12 legions of angels? It's imagined, class, that Jesus would be able to call down fire on these people if he wanted to. And he refused to hit back. He practiced here at the moment of his arrest and his impending execution. He practiced here what he preached previously. This is my body broken for you. Take, take, take. He gave and expected nothing in return. This is the Jesus that Martin Luther King Jr. believes speaks to us in our times of trouble, when we are faced with a moral catastrophe where to do nothing seems wrong, but to do something could risk our lives and the lives of many, many, many others. King, you see, had been at a time inspired by and influenced by Professor Reinhold Niebuhr. I mentioned him to you before in the earliest of the class, who had kind of a realistic approach to war. And of course, World War II, the Allied forces took out an Adolf Hitler. So Dr. King suggested there was a time when I felt that war could be a negative good. I never felt that war could be a positive good, but I felt that war could block the spread of some negative evil force like a Hitler. His subsequent experiences, though, taught him that this was based on some faulty premises and some kind of unexamined assumptions about the power of retribution and revenge. King in the autobiography, in a passage we talked about earlier, acknowledged Niebuhr's contribution to the false optimism that people were essentially good. Niebuhr, he believed, had insight into human nature and the behavior of nations and social groups, the powers and the principalities. He was keenly aware of the complexity of human motions and the human motives and the relation between morality and power. So Niebuhrian theology is a persistent reminder of the reality of sin on every level of our existence. These elements in Niebuhr's thinking helped King recognize the illusions of a superficial optimism concerning human nature. Well, I still believe in man's potential for good. Niebuhr made me realize his potential for evil as well. This is King now. And King says many pacifists, I think, failed to see this. All too many had an unwarranted optimism concerning humanity and leaned unconsciously towards self-righteousness. It was my revolt against these attitudes under the influence of Niebuhr that accounts for the fact that in spite of my strong leaning toward pacifism, I never joined a pacifist organization. As reading Niebuhr, I tried to arrive at a realistic pacifism. In other words, I came to see the pacifist position not as sinless, but as the lesser evil in the circumstances. I felt then, and I feel now, that the pacifist would have a greater appeal if he did not claim to be free from the moral dilemmas that the Christian non-pacifists confront. Martin Luther King Jr. said, those who love peace must organize as effectively as the war hawks as they spread the propaganda of war. We must spread the propaganda of peace. There are contemporaries of Dr. King who were very far to be peace radicals. Now, Thomas Merton on the right was a monk living in Kentucky who had taken vows and was bound by his life and work as a brother in a monastic order of male Catholics here in Kentucky. And so he wasn't on the front line of any protest movement, but Brother Lewis, as he was called, Merton wrote book after book after book about the importance of peace. Merton actually said that it's the war itself that is evil, not the people that participate in the war. He said the war itself is evil. The people who participate in wars are still good people. I think this is incredibly important for us to remember because I think the temptation is simply to condemn and to diminish the humanity of our enemy. This is what the police do to the protester when they're beating their head, and this is what the protester does to the police officer. We dehumanize our adversary. Merton said that in times of war, we should remember this formula, that in the madness of modern war, when every crime is justified, the nation is always right and power is always right and the military is always right. So to be a questioner and to differ from the might makes right and might is always right logic of the state and of the army would be that we ourselves as Christians, as believers, as peaceniks, as any person of goodwill who aligns themselves with this kind of peace ethic would be considered subversive, rebellious, and a traitor to nation states. It's a very high calling. It's a very low calling. It's a calling that has consequences for us in the real world should we adopt a peace ethic. Daniel Berrigan on the right said, peacemaking is hard almost as war. The difference being one we can stake life upon in limb and thought and love. He writes this in a poem. He said, I stake this poem out, dead man to a dead stick, to tempt an Easter chance. If faith may be truth, our evil chance penultimate at last, not last. We are not lost. When these lines gathered of no resource at all, serenity and strength, it dawned on me. A man stood on his nails, as ash like dew, a sweat smelling of death and life. Our evil Friday fled, the blind face gently turned another way toward life. A man walks in his shroud. Daniel Berrigan, as you can see him here in handcuffs, went with some friends to the draft board. And this is before we had computers. This is before we had cell phones, the internet. They were computers, but they took up a whole room and they weren't widespread. And so the draft board had files and files on all the American men who were supposed to conscript and enlist to serve in Vietnam. They were keeping up with you. If you were a young man of draft age, they were keeping tabs on you. Big Brother knew where you were, and they had it in a filing cabinet. And Berrigan and his buddies went in and they broke in there and they took a bunch of the files out and they dumped them in the parking lot and they set them on fire with homemade napalm. They committed vandalism for peace, and they performed a Catholic worship service, a Christian worship service, while they were burning with fake, or I should say homemade napalm, these draft files. And then when he was to be detained, he was giving a speech to a bunch of peace activists. Of course, among the hippie youth, he became kind of a folk hero. Here's a priest, a Catholic priest, who's like us, who thinks like us, who thinks of this war like we think of this war. And he went AWOL. He went on the lam. He became a fugitive from justice. He hid inside of a giant puppet and snuck out of the rally at Cornell University. He was on FBI's most wanted list, this Catholic priest, Daniel Berrigan, this anti-war priest, because he believed you had to fight for peace. This is like the people who did the sit-ins. We don't have to agree with their tactics. We can even say that their tactics themselves are violent, but this is the level that we were at in the peak hours of the Vietnam War. And so when King makes his speech, I just want you to have in context that he had fellow travelers in the church that were as adamantly and as outspokenly for peace as he would. And I think people would see Berrigan, Daniel Berrigan, as more of a fringe character, more of a freak, side guy, because it's a pretty extreme what he did. It's beautiful if that's what you believe in and you share his motives and his values, but let's not fake it that it wasn't controversial or it didn't have consequences. He was eventually apprehended at the home of his pal William Stringfellow on this little island called Block Island off the East Coast, and he starts praying Catholic prayers with the people that are arresting him, and one of the arresting officers was also Catholic and started saying the prayers with him as he was carting Father Berrigan off to jail. I think we've heard leaders say we don't do body counts, we don't do death counts. It's particularly difficult in the chaos of a wartime scenario to keep accurate figures, humanitarian figures of the cost of war. We're experiencing the same problem right now in Ukraine, and we don't know exactly how many Ukrainians have died, how many civilians, how many soldiers, how many Russians have died. So these are estimates that 1,353,000 Vietnamese died and 58,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. Every single one of those an image bearer of our Creator, if you believe that. Everyone a beloved child of God, if that's what you believe, that we were all created in the image of our Creator. King's peace ethic. He is against war. He's against war in general. He's not against some wars. He's against all wars, though he does see occasionally that war can be a negative good. His peace ethic is not based in the Beatles song Revolution or All You Need Is Love, or even in a Bob Dylan song like Masters of War or Blowing in the Wind, not in a Peter, Paul, and Mary song, If I Had a Hammer. His peace ethic is based in the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, as documented in the 4 canonical Gospels. He believes that the nuclear reality, which we're still living in today, is that the choice today is not between nonviolence and violence, but between nonviolence and non-existence. And we're at the cliff's edge right now of a nuclear war with Russia. Right now, like as we speak, just like yesterday, Russia was asked on television. This is a Russian who's fluent in English and is willing to go on CNN or MSNBC or what have you, and is asked, will you guys denounce the possibility of nuclear weapons? Will you take nukes off the table? And this is one of Putin's, top dogs. And they said, no. Both Russia and the United States have first strike doctrine, meaning not only are they willing to use nuclear weapons, they're willing to use nuclear weapons preemptively against an enemy, meaning they're willing to use nuclear weapons before the other guy does. Shoot first. Dr. King, as the Nobel Peace Prize winner, really relished and reminded us and reiterated that we have the obligation to be affirmational about peace as much as we are negative and saying bad against war. It's not just trashing the war machine, but actually building the beloved community through affirmative actions of peace. Peace with justice, which means feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, housing the homeless, providing healthcare, providing school education, providing nonviolent alternatives to the things that create violence. He believed that war in Vietnam was inherently racist. America has waged some of its most aggressive wars against non-white targets: Japan, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. In the United States, because of the economics of war, we draft Black people. Our army is very much a rainbow flavored army. We have a lot of people of color, Indigenous, Black, Latino. We have a lot of Americans of color in the war profession. Professional soldiers come from the streets. Sometimes they come from rough upbringings. So Dr. King believed that the war was racist, that it was drafting Black men disproportionately to white men, and it was targeting a non-white enemy. Every bomb that we build, and we build a lot, our military budget is very, very, very expensive. Our Pentagon budget is huge, is money that we're not spending on food. The World Food Program admits that the grain production in Russia and Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and that people will starve simply because the grain harvest will be either delayed or not accomplished from Russia and Ukraine due to the war. Poverty itself is considered to be a form of violence. And don't even get me started about wage theft or wage inequality. Dr. King believed that our greatness would be in learning to be more humble, but he believed that as an empire and as the police of the world, that we are arrogant. And he would quote the Bible all day long to say what God says about the arrogant nations of the world, that God will be the vindicator of violent, arrogant, war-making nations. God's judgment is not always nice in the Bible, and it's definitely not nice when it comes to leaders who are appointed and anointed, who violate their vows and their oaths to serve humanity. He's not an advocate of fake peace. He's not an advocate of passivism. Pacifism is not the same as passivism. He believes strongly in active resistance that is nonviolent. He does not believe of standing on the street and watching your neighbor beat the crap out of your other neighbor. He believes that you can intervene nonviolently. This has not been tried on a mass scale, but we have had nonviolent revolutions. The revolution in South Africa, for example, was a nonviolent revolution. Dr. King also had allies in the Black community in Cassius Clay of Louisville, Kentucky. He changed his name to Muhammad Ali. Ali also, of course, as you know, had connections to Brother Malcolm X, who we've learned about quite a bit in this class. Muhammad Ali lost his heavyweight credentials for refusing to fight in this war, the Vietnam War. Muhammad Ali said, "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? No, I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation simply to continue the domination of the white slave master on the darker people the world over. This is the day when such evils must come to an end." Martin Luther King Jr. got depressed thinking about the war. He said, "Food will no longer taste good until we figure out how to stop this war." King believed that this was all because life is interconnected, international, and interdependent. I talked a little bit last week about the cosmic king. Let us remind us again of the cosmic king. Martin said that in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. Lifting you up is not putting me down. There doesn't have to always be winners and losers. There can be winners and winners. Human beings can support each other. We can be fans of each other. We can build each other up. Martin said, "It must be emphasized that nonviolent resistance is not a method for cowards. It does resist. If one uses this method because one is afraid of or merely because one lacks the instrument of violence, that's not true nonviolence. Even Gandhi said that if cowardice is the alternative, it is better to fight." So a courageous nonviolence is resistance, active, organized resistance through affinity groups, through communities organizing around police violence in their neighborhood, communities locking arms to protect a home, becoming a human shield against the neighborhood drug dealer, the neighborhood gangster, and not to mention exporting and amplifying this active peace ethic to the global scale. It is possible. It has been attempted successfully on the stage of global affairs, but we live in a cynical world where war is glorified and romanticized on television and video games, and war is quite profitable for what's been called by President Eisenhower the military-industrial complex, the arms manufacturers, the war profiteers. I've heard that even today they are having conference calls where they're gloating about the success of their business. Their stock is going up. This is a good time to buy stock in Raytheon and Lockheed Martin if all you care about is money, because they're selling more arms. European countries are increasing their military budgets. Countries that have been neutral, countries that have been essentially passive or pacifistic are getting amped up for war. Because of what's happening in the Russo-Ukrainian war that started in 2014 and escalated extremely for the last month. There's also the personal pacifism and the interpersonal pacifism of resolving our interpersonal conflicts in our families and communities nonviolently, in our homes, in our disputes with our spouses and our children and our parents, in our neighborhoods, and considering whether or not owning a gun, for example, makes you safer or not, depending on your context and your ability to use a firearm and your training and where you live. This is a hot button topic in the South. I'm not going to go out on a limb here and say that no one should ever own a gun. That I personally choose as a Kingian disciple of this and a disciple of the Jesus path in nonviolence. I choose personally not to own weapons of any kind, and I have experienced violence. I'm mostly privileged, and most of us are extremely privileged to not have to experience direct violence in our lives. But I have been beat up before. I have been attacked before, and I've suffered those blows, and I've not retaliated. Now, it happens that I'm 5'7" and I'm not really a tough guy. and I have no training in any martial arts or in any combat or anything. I'm not fit for that game of war. But my commitment to these ideals are come from another place, and I have laid my body down nonviolently. And some of the violence that I've suffered has been at the hands of law enforcement when I was protesting against war and injustice as a young person. I also was attacked once randomly while riding my bicycle home from work in Detroit, where I used to live, and I didn't seek revenge or justice against the perpetrators of that attack. I couldn't identify them if they showed up. I couldn't see. It was night. I licked my wounds. I ended up going to the hospital. I've got several metal plates in my head. I probably could have died that night, but I chose not to seek revenge or retaliation. And to be honest with you, it never crossed my mind. That doesn't make me a saint, and I don't think it makes me a sissy. It's just how committed I am to this, and also how impractical I think revenge actually is. I don't think revenge and war are particularly realistic. I don't think they're particularly effective. I do believe that peace affords the better way. I think it is a better way to treat other human beings, and negotiations are better than bombs. So I love this topic. I care passionately about this topic, but I also acknowledge that there are people right now who are having their homes attacked who have chosen to defend themselves. People who are having their whole communities bombed and decimated, and who have chosen to rise up and defend themselves militarily against a war, an aggressive war that's taking place on their community. I'm going to stop the recording. I appreciate you guys listening. Before I start the movies, I would love to do a quick go round on the screen like we do, and hear from you all on your experience.